Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Inner Loop YouTube channel. I'm Lena, the new face of our Author's Corner series, and today I'll be having a conversation with Dan Brady about his collection of poetry, Subtexts. For more Dan and more Author's Corner, you can check out our website to find articles, interviews, podcast episodes, and most importantly, a link to purchase the book. So welcome, Dan. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Awesome. So just to dive straight in, I'd love to talk about form for quite a while. So many of the poems in this collection are sort of these fascinating erasure poems from your own work, if I'm not mistaken. So your own original source material that sort of expand and contract, and then we'll get the whole block of prose, poetry, original source text, and then it'll sort of erase again into these fascinating new poems and creations. So I'd love to just hear kind of your erasure definition. So what is an erasure poem for viewers and readers who may be less familiar? And then how do you approach it?
Sure. Yeah. So the way erasure poetry typically works is you start with an existing text, which could be, a page from a novel, a newspaper, the Declaration of Independence, whatever you choose. And you erase words and phrases until you're left with just a few things behind, and that the remaining text forms the new erasure poem. So usually you have an independent existing source text, and then you whittle it down to what you want to be the new poem. In my work here, I did a little bit differently. Like you said, I started with my own prose text and then erased it multiple times to create a kind of sequence that would build in or pull out from that original text, which you also get to see. Usually in erasure poems, you don't see the source text. Maybe it's something familiar that you know, but oftentimes you just see what remains.
Yeah, I love that approach too, because we do get that reveal after kind of several iterations. And so there's this lovely kind of cyclicality to it. So how did the erasures in the collection develop? Did you kind of approach them one by one in terms of, cabin fever and then terms of service? Or did you kind of hit on one and you were like, I'm going to do this. This is a dedicated project?
Yeah. So yes, it was a dedicated project because I had seen some paintings and I was thinking about paintings working in layers. And I thought, how can a poem work in layers like that? And as I pretty quickly discovered, erasure seemed to be a natural fit for that because there's already two layers. There's the existing text and whatever you create. So I wanted to see how I could push that even further. And it took some getting used to and figuring out how it all works. But once I hit on this idea that I could have multiple erasures of the same text, it became a sort of a technique I was using. And after I had done a few of them, I thought, maybe I can kind of keep pushing this, try it in slightly different ways, and it could be its own sort of book-length project.
Yeah, you do get the sense that there's such continuity with the form and the content that you can kind of see a perspective that's sustained throughout for sure. So had you engaged with erasure to this extent before Subtexts?
Not really. I had read a bunch of erasure. I remember finding Jen Bervin's Nets, which erases Shakespeare sonnets in a bookstore and just like immediately falling in love with it. And Wave Poetry used to have this tool on their website where they had text that you could erase and do different versions of. So I played around with that, but I had never really seriously worked with erasure or published anything that was erasure poetry. So this was kind of my baptism by fire, kind of like once I figured out that this was the technique I was going to use, I was kind of all in on learning how the form works and what the potential was there and applying that to my own writing.
Yeah, so you kind of hinted at this just now, but so many of the poems, theme-wise, at least in my opinion, or like how I read it, was that so many of them kind of look at the smallness of an individual life in all of history, biology, the face of beauty and aesthetics and government control and surveillance. And I'm curious, like, A, did anything in your life or the world sort of spark your thinking about these subjects? And why erasure to tackle those themes?
Yeah. So, the not the first poem, but one of the early poems in the book is Fossil Record. And I was an English major in college, but I minored in paleontology, and I was always really interested in geology. So I was pretty into it and seriously considering a career in that for a while. So that was sort of part of my background. I like thinking about really large scale kind of time and big issues like that. And I think, and that applies to government and climate change, everything. And I think what erasure allowed me to do was, those things are so huge, you can't really comprehend them all at once. You look at them kind of piece by piece, you see this is like what's causing this over here, which is tied to this over here, but it's very difficult to hold the whole picture in your mind at one time. So by taking these kind of slices of my own thinking about these issues, I could mimic that on the page. This section focuses on this little part of the issue, and this is over here, and it kind of builds the big picture, but allows me to do it sort of step by step.
Yeah, I love how the kind of, for lack of a better word, the arc of the erasure differs after the apex of it, which might be considered sort of the reveal of the source text. And then as it sort of either waxes or wanes after that, you get a kind of different theme coming through. Yeah, Fossil Record was really fascinating because I just loved the kind of, like, hubris is not the exact word that I mean or I'm looking for, but just the kind of badassery of writing a whole history of the world in terms of life on Earth. I'm curious, how did it feel to do that? And, when did you sort of sit down and you were like, I know that this is one of the erasures that I'm doing?
Yeah, well, so once I sort of figured out that this was the form I wanted to use, I started thinking about what topics might lend themselves to that. And geology exists as layers of soil that you can kind of trace time backwards through. So I thought, well, that's interesting. It plays on this layers idea, and I have some experience there. But the scope of it was a little daunting. And also, it's just, a lot of the material is strange. It's old animals and weird parts of the Earth's history that we don't think about or talk about much. So I had to be a little bit careful to make sure the reader could still follow what was happening. So creating like a thread through that was important to me. But yeah, that pretty early on, I thought there's a lot of potential to explore there. Let me see what I can do with this kind of geology idea.
Yeah, and I love the sort of matter-of-fact way it's delivered in these sort of staccato sentences, but even the first line or first phrase, it happens like this, formation of Earth, like very kind of step by step and methodical.
Yeah, I mean, that was also a practical consideration, just to try to condense everything down, need it to be sort of like short, this ticks on a timeline sort of thing.
Yeah. So I'm curious how you approached erasing your own writing. And did it feel different? Were there different freedoms or limitations than erasing other source material?
Yeah. I think the part of the reason why I took that approach was it gave me more control, knowing that I would need to erase this material several times and get different meanings and different slants out of it. I needed it to be both interesting enough that there was, different images I could draw on, but also kind of plain enough that I had the connective language to tie these phrases together. So it was kind of that decision of like, if I do this with someone else's work, I'm probably not going to be able to get the result I want because I won't have that control.
Mm,
Um, as I sort of dove into erasure, there's also a lot of sort of political, ethical questions to it because you're taking someone else's work for the most part and creating something else from it. So it's immediately a commentary on whatever the original work was, and you need to decide, whose work is okay to engage with, and how does what you say relate to the original text. So there's a lot more consideration that you have to have when working with someone else's original text. So this kind of freed me up from that as well. But it also challenged me and freed me to explore what was within my own thoughts. I would usually write the prose block first and then dig into it and see like, well, what might be hiding here? What was the thing that was in my mind that I didn't actually say, but somehow exists in this language? And I could pull that out. So that was really eye-opening because it led me in directions I wouldn't have gone just myself.
mm. Do any moments stand out in your recollection of the writing of these poems, like sort of light bulb moments where the form revealed something about, your own ideas or work to you?
So I look back on some of these poems like Cabin Fever, which is about the snowstorm that hit DC in February 2010 that's like shut down the city for a week. And, my son was a couple months old at that point, maybe 4 or 5 months old. And in some ways that poem is this sort of like blissful family time, but in the backside of the poem, it becomes this kind of strange, anxious period where we don't know what's going to happen. And I think, both those things were probably true. It was a really great time to have a young family and we got to spend all this time together, but also it was a difficult time and a time of life change. And I wasn't sure what was going to happen, what kind of father I would be, all these kinds of like questions about myself. So seeing that those moods come through that isn't necessarily on face what the text is about, but there's this sort of like emotional undertone to it. I think when I discovered that, I thought, okay, this is really something that, it will reveal deeper things than I intend, which I like. So,
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. I'm curious also, you mentioned this term kind of connective language and the connective tissue of the source text. What did you mean by that? And how do you go about adding it in if you don't already have it and you realize you need it?
yeah. So what part of any erasure, even a standard erasure, you find the words that stick out to you. So you have like, just following a typical sentence structure, you start with like a noun, then you need a verb, and maybe you have another clause that comes after that. So I had to think about, okay, if, baby is my noun here, what can a baby do or not do, or what would be a verb that would sort of challenge your expectations there? And then I could find that one. And then, how do I modify this phrase? And as the layers build, the phrase changes because new language is injected between each of those original pieces.
Mm,
So you need to have that sort of basic syntax down, and you need to have just simple words and is has available to you so that you can modify the meaning as you go.
mm,
Um, so how do I add that back in? There were a couple times where I had written the prose block and then for whatever reason, it wasn't working and I needed something else in a certain place, and I could throw in, a modifying phrase to the prose block, and then it would appear where I needed it to in the other poems. So editing these things was a real I don't know, bummer, drag. It was harsh, like, because once you change something in one place, you have to change it on every page. So it was kind of a crazy making editing process.
I imagine it's, and I've heard fiction writers talk about this, that when you change something plot wise, that then alters everything else that came before it, then it's, yeah. And I was looking at Cabin Fever and sort of thinking about, these connective words. And there was one moment that really stood out to me in one of the erasures of it, where I realized that when I read it multiple times, my eye was it was making new combinations
Mm.
of words. And there's one at the end that I just kind of wanted to point out, where at first I read it as to be back, never again. And then the second time I read it as never to be back again. And I just love that there is this kind of tone shift depending on how your brain draws those kind of visual connections. And I'm curious, did you intend for these to be able to be read multiple ways? Would you prefer that they be read in a certain way? When you yourself read them, do you always read them in one kind of linear way?
Yeah, I definitely intended that they could be read different ways. So as I started to erase, I took out all the punctuation so that as a reader reads the page, they have to decide, where does this phrase stop? Where does the next one begin? And sometimes there's ambiguity. Things could be pushed together that, maybe it should be, maybe it shouldn't be. That's up to me, but also up to the reader. I do tend to have a sort of understanding myself of how I want it to flow. So as I give readings, I typically follow the same sort of pace that is my internal voice of how I read it. But I've heard people read the poems or talk to them and they quote something to me, and it's an entirely different way than I would have understood it. So it's cool that it has that flexibility and range, that you can find, how does this sound in your own head and how do you make sense of it? And there's opportunity for new meanings to arise even between one reader to another.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like this is a great segue into talking a little bit about the painter who inspired at least some of the poems in this collection, Eugene Leroy. I hope
Yeah.
I'm saying it correctly. And you've spoken in previous interviews about kind of this drive to create a three-dimensional poem, which I just love that phrase. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about his work, what drew you to it, and how you see your poems in conversation with his paintings.
Yeah, so Eugene Leroy was a French painter in the last century. He died in the early 2000s. And his method was, he would start with a sort of representative figure, a woman or a vase of flowers or a portrait of someone. And that first version would be pretty realistic. And then he would just keep painting over it with the same image. So, the same woman, the same vase, the same postman's face or whatever it was. And as he added layer upon layer, that original figure became less clear. And if you see his paintings, the paint is like this thick on the canvas. You can like dip your hand into it almost. I thought that was really cool. I've never seen that used to that effect before. And I thought that's really interesting. I wonder, repetition is part of poetry. It's one of the most powerful elements of poetry that we have. So I was thinking about this idea of repetition and layers and what would that look like? And I think, part of what he was trying to do was show sort of like a cubist perspective, where it's like you're showing this thing from multiple angles, layers, perspectives. And I thought that's how our minds work and how language works. Even as I'm trying to explain this, I'm sort of talking around this perfect idea of it in my head, but not actually, it's not transmitting from my mind to yours. I have to piece this together and apply enough layers that you develop a picture of what I'm trying to communicate, and you develop this understanding. So I thought that his method could apply to language and poetry in particular. And I just needed to figure out how to do it. And this kind of erasure technique is what I settled on. I still think like, well, maybe there's a different way to do it. I don't know, but this was the best way I figured out. So yeah.
I love how even the form of text on the page, in a way, it is so three-dimensional because you are sort of taking this idea and turning it, and each facet creates this new erasure. But it's still a painting on the wall, right? It's still text on the page. And I love that kind of even almost literal connection.
Yeah. I've wanted to see if I could get like each page of the poem kind of etched into glass and then lay it in layers. I thought that would be like the true version of what is in my head, I think. So you could look down into it and see what repeats and what doesn't and that kind of thing. But I don't have the skill to do that. So.
I would pay to see that. I feel like that would be incredible. Yeah. And you mentioned refrains and repetition, and something that I did love in many of these poems, I don't know all, that it'll start with at least one word that then will repeat throughout. And then you kind of get to see it in its context when the prose block is revealed. So even, Cabin Fever here, how magical it had been, repeats on almost, I think, on every page. So how do you arrive at that first line? Does it take a lot of attempts to really find this sort of emotional core?
Sometimes it's more intuitive. I think with that poem in particular, I was looking for something that was a little bit not catchy, but like intriguing, like that could be the start of a fairy tale. It's a phrase that could appear at the beginning of a story and in the middle, or could be the very last line of a story. So I needed something that had that kind of versatility to it, that I could then build around it. I also think it sort of distills what the poem is. If you had to summarize, especially the sort of like family snowstorm part of it, it felt magical. It was this amazing time when, we were let off the hook for everything and we could just be together. So I thought it distilled the poem into one little phrase that was attention grabbing, but also didn't reveal that much, so that I could reveal more along the way. And I think a lot of the other poems, I probably use the same rubric to decide what should be that first phrase in each of them.
That's really fascinating. And I mean, hearing sort of the thought process behind Cabin Fever specifically, that line does have this wonderful sort of enigmatic quality where is it nostalgia? Is it regret? Is it, Yeah, I love that. So I'd love to skip to kind of the end of the collection, and talk a little bit about the last poem. So I noticed, there are so many themes sort of at work and layering themselves on top of one another throughout the collection. But one that really stood out towards the end to me was this theme of agency and choice and making choices, the choices we don't make, and how that sort of builds this collective consciousness even. So, and even, the very last line in the whole collection, perhaps it is time to decide again. And I'm curious, what were your thoughts about agency and choice while writing this work, and sort of what is being chosen?
Yeah. On a very literal level, I was choosing what words to include here as I did the erasures. But I think on a more personal, social level, the last, 10, 20 years have been trying times on a number of fronts. And so the idea of choice, and we don't have control over everything, but we do have control over the choices that we make and how we think about things. And in some ways, every time you turn the page in this book, you have this chance to start over and decide what this is about anew. And I think that life is like that, it's okay to change your mind about things and decide, I was wrong, I didn't see it then, but I see it now, by taking that sort of different slice of perspective at it. So that idea that you can always decide to choose something better for yourself and for society is important to me. And I wanted that message to come across, as the book addresses climate change and mental health and all these issues that that everyone deals with and struggles with. You can hopefully decide to move in a more generous direction that extends more grace to other people, and you get to make that decision every day. So choice was really important, I think, as a theme of the book.
And did you know, once you wrote that poem, did you know that that was going to be the ending poem in the collection? Or tell me a little bit about the organization of the book as a whole.
Yeah, I think I did know. And I think that was one of the last poems I wrote. I think I was looking for a kind of concluding summary type piece. The order of the poems in the book, I was worried that people wouldn't grasp the concept soon enough. So I tried to introduce it slowly. The first poem in the book is called Face to Face, and it's laid out much more traditionally. It's lineated, it's fairly short sections, but you get the idea that these lines are repeating, and you see the same words are being used in the same order, even though there's other pieces that are missing. So I wanted to kind of introduce that concept and then move into the sort of full-blown prose block erased sort of what happens through most of the book. And then that last poem, Meaning of Life, kind of combines the two. It is lineated and shorter, but it also maintains the words in place on the page. So maybe you get kind of the full effect, or there's more poetic technique brought to bear in that poem than some of the others. So I wanted you to kind of learn how to read the poems as you read the book. And I thought that piece was a good place to end. That was sort of showing everything that I had figured out about how this could possibly work. I'm sure there's more to discover, but for now, that's where I'm at. So.
Yeah, you do definitely get this sense of kind of like this building symphony, and then, all of the instruments at once. Yeah. And you end on the full kind of unerased poem itself, which feels in some way obviously open, and we're left with so many questions, and we continue to think about these themes, but it does have some sense of finality to it, which I loved.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that much about music, but I know there's some chords that kind of like conclude a song, and I feel like it was a closing moment that felt complete and ready to stop in a way. So
definitely, and you definitely feel that as the reader as well. So I'd love to end with the question that we ask all of our authors that we feature on the Authors Corner series, because we are featuring authors who publish with small presses. Tell us a little bit about your experience publishing with your small press and your publishing journey.
Sure, yeah. I love small presses. I work on a small press and magazine called Barrel House, so I've been on both the editorial side and the writer side. My first two books here came out from Publishing Genius, which is run by Adam Robinson, and it was an amazing experience both times. I mean, when you're working with a small press, it's a much more personal, intimate experience. I had a ton of input on the cover, the layout, every choice along the way. It was a true partnership. And I know some folks with bigger presses often find, you kind of send off the manuscript, then it's a black box, and suddenly they send you a cover and you're like, okay, I guess that's my cover. But this was the opposite of that. It was totally fun and collaborative, and I really got the book I wanted out of it. Um, so, I'm 100% on board in favor of small presses. And most poetry is published by small presses anyway. So I think those are the folks that are connected to the readers of poetry and can really help you get your work to the folks who want to engage with that kind of work. So
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, well, they did a wonderful job. I love this cover. So do you have any plugs, anything, you want readers and viewers to know about coming down the pipe, and where we can find you online?
sure, yeah. So you can find me on any social media at Dan Brady 82. And I've got a couple things coming up in the fall. I'm going to be teaching a class on very short poems for the Writers Center. So that should be opening for registration in the next couple weeks. So keep an eye out for that. My third book is coming out from Transfer Books. So I don't have a specific timeline on that, but sometime soon. I'm excited about that one. And then through Barrel House, we have a new issue coming out in the fall and a new book by Justin Marks, a poetry book that is really excellent. So there's lots of good things on the horizon. So, follow and
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, can't wait. Congratulations on the third book. I cannot wait to read it. And thank you so much. This has been such a joy, such a fascinating conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us in the Author's Corner. For more conversations with DC area authors and to stay updated about the latest from small independent presses, subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook at The Inner Loop DC and on Twitter and Instagram at The Inner Loop Lit.